Between June 1941 and February 1942, the Third Reich and the Soviet Union clashed in a titanic struggle which changed the course of history. In the battle for Russia, the German Wehrmacht, the most highly trained and successful military machine on earth, attempted to defeat the Red Army and win for Germany a vast Eastern Empire. The result was a collision of unprecedented violence. Beginning with the German invasion and culminating in the fight for Moscow, more men, tanks, guns and aircraft were committed to the inferno than had ever before been thrown into any battle. With each side led by an unscrupulous dictator and each army driven by a pitiless ideology, war was waged with a ferocity and barbarism up to then unimaginable. To Adolf Hitler, the assault on the Soviet Union was meant to bring a victory unmatched in the annals of warfare. In reality, the battle for Russia would end in disaster for Germany. Instead of a lightning conquest, the Wehrmacht would suffer a catastrophic defeat, a defeat that would mark the beginning of the end for Hitler's Reich. In Moscow, on August the 23rd, 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed an agreement which shocked the world. The Third Reich, the most violently anti-communist regime in existence, had agreed to cooperate with Stalin's dictatorship. Each undertook not to attack the other, and huge quantities of Soviet food, oil and minerals would be exchanged for German manufactured goods. There was also a secret protocol, a protocol which assigned to Germany and Russia their own spheres of influence in Europe, areas in which the other would not interfere. For Adolf Hitler, the agreement came just in time. His armies were already massing on the Polish border, and he needed an absolute assurance from the Russians that they would not intervene if he invaded. 8 days after the signing of the Nazi-Soviet pact, German armies surged across Polish frontiers. For the Poles, struggling desperately in the face of the Nazi tide, the German-Soviet pact quickly took on a chilling reality. 2 weeks into the battle, the Red Army invaded Poland from the east. With German connivance, the Soviets were to take more than half the country. Within a few days of Hitler's attack on Poland, Britain and France had declared war on Germany. To Joseph Stalin, the sight of the great European powers at each other's throats was deeply satisfying. It was a priceless opportunity to seize yet more territory with little fear of opposition. Anxious to strengthen his northern flank, Stalin demanded strategically important areas of Finland. He was refused, and on November the 30th, 1939, 29 divisions of the Red Army attacked across Finnish borders. Russian forces were deployed in 5 armies. south, the main blow was struck by 7th and 13th Armies, pushing across the Karelian Isthmus. To the world's amazement, the Finns checked the advance. In the north, the Russian 14th Army cut off the port of Petsamo on the Arctic coast, a strategically important nickel mining area. However, in the center, the Soviets suffered humiliating defeats. The most costly when a penetration by 9th Army was completely cut off and destroyed. The battle for Finland lasted 4 months, during which a Finnish army of only 9 divisions fought with exceptional determination. The terrain was a wilderness of lakes and forests, greatly favoring the defenders. And it was only when the Soviets brought up another 11 divisions, more armor and heavy air power, that the Red Army made a significant breakthrough. In March 1940, the Finns were forced to sue for peace. To the Red Army, which had thrown 1 million men into the battle, the cost of the Finnish war was almost 200,000 killed. But the real damage was even greater. In the eyes of the world, the much-vaunted Soviet armed forces looked incompetent and utterly ineffective. Less than a month after the end of the Soviet-Finnish War, Adolf Hitler launched his own campaign of conquest in Scandinavia. On April the 9th, Norway and Denmark were invaded by land, sea and air. The invasions were carried out with ruthless efficiency. The Germans had complete control of the skies, and in spite of interventions by the British Royal Navy and a Franco-British expeditionary force, within weeks, all of Denmark and most of Norway were in German hands. However, for the Western Allies, the worst blows were yet to come. On May the 10th, 1940, 7 German armies, spearheaded by powerful armored formations, struck at France and the Low Countries. For the campaign in the West, the Germans deployed 3 army groups. Army Group A in the center was given most of the armored formations. Facing the Wehrmacht were the Belgian and Dutch armies, 3 French army groups, and a highly mobile British expeditionary force. In the north, Army Group B swept into Holland and northern Belgium, drawing the French and British up to meet them. In the center, Army Group A, spearheaded by its panzer groups, bypassed the fortifications of the Maginot Line, smashed through thin French defenses, and raced into the interior. The tanks then swung north to reach the Channel coast. By May the 27th, most of the Allies' best divisions and almost all their mobile formations were trapped in a huge cauldron. By June the 5th, the pocket had been all but eliminated, and the British had been evacuated from Dunkirk. The main German effort now switched to the south. And 4 days later, Army Group B reached the Seine below Paris. Army Group A broke through on May the 12th, and with Army Group C, encircled French forces behind the Maginot Line. With the French retreating all along the front, on June the 17th, the government sued for peace. In less than 6 weeks, Germany had conquered 4 countries and 250,000 square miles of territory. On June the 22nd, the French signed the armistice that confirmed Adolf Hitler as master of Western Europe. The campaign had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. But even as his generals looked forward to their field marshals' batons, their estates, and the wealth of plunder that would be theirs, Hitler's own thoughts were elsewhere. He had won his empire, but he also faced a fundamental strategic problem. To sustain the German military machine, the Reich needed oil, raw materials, and foodstuffs, and neither Germany nor the newly conquered territories could provide them. Hitler worried that Germany was already dependent on huge imports from the Soviet Union, and there was no telling how long these would be forthcoming. Even more troubling, Russia had once again taken advantage of German commitments in the West. To the Soviet conquest of eastern Poland in September 1939, and the seizure of Finnish territory that winter, Stalin now added the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. In June 1940, they were declared part of the Soviet Union, threatening German trade in the Baltic. Hitler's reply was an agreement with the Finns that would allow German troops on Finnish soil. The next stirrings of Soviet ambition were felt in the south. Romania was ordered to hand over Bessarabia and northern Bukovina. And on June the 27th, these territories were occupied by the Red Army. Romania was Germany's main source of oil, and the Soviets now had strong forces massed within striking distance. Hitler's response was to deploy powerful formations in Poland, and later he would win a string of agreements, allowing him to send German troops to Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria. While Germany and the Soviet Union jockeyed for advantage in the Balkans and the Baltic, in the West, there remained a thorn in Germany's side. Britain was still defiant. Her army had been driven from France, leaving nearly all its heavy weapons behind. But Winston Churchill, the new Prime Minister, was refusing to negotiate. Not only did he proclaim that Britain would fight to the end, but he also launched a diplomatic initiative to turn Russia against Germany. In fact, Stalin had no intention of being drawn into a war which could only benefit the capitalist West. The British overture was firmly rebuffed. By the time Adolf Hitler had returned to Berlin after his triumphant campaign in France, he had already made up his mind to attack and conquer the Soviet Union. From the beginning, Hitler had built the Nazi Party on a deep hatred of communists, Jews, and Slavs, and he was convinced that Soviet communism was a Jewish conspiracy. Now he had a unique opportunity to destroy his ideological and racial enemies. At the same time, he could win for Germany the resources that would secure the Reich for generations to come. Hitler was haunted by two great fears. The first was that the Soviet Union, already embarked on a massive armaments program, would soon be so well prepared for war that the chance of a successful German attack would vanish forever. The second was the prospect of an alliance between Russia, Britain, and the United States. An alliance which Germany's slender resources could never defeat. Hitler concluded that the Reich's only hope of survival lay in the complete destruction of the Soviet in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. Since 1928, Joseph Stalin had kept his position of supreme power in the Soviet Union by the most devious and ruthless means. Everyone who might conceivably threaten his authority was killed. In 1937, he had turned his attention to the Soviet armed forces. In a relentless sweep, Stalin executed all 11 deputy commissars for defense, 3 out of 5 field marshals, 13 out of 15 army commanders, and tens of thousands of middle-ranking and junior officers. Many more were sent to labor camps. Stalin replaced the executed senior commanders with cronies from his Civil War days, however incompetent, and within a year, the Red Army was firmly under the dictator's personal control. In 1940, the army's humiliation at the hands of the Finns had persuaded Stalin that the Soviet armed forces had to be reformed. The incredible speed of Germany's victory over France only underlined the urgency of the task. However, with so many of Russia's most effective commanders gone, progress was slow and hesitant. Although Stalin was deeply worried about German intentions, he was sure that while Britain was still fighting, Hitler would never attack the Soviet Union. The German leader would apply pressure to get what he wanted, but unless he was provoked, Hitler would stop short of actual war. Surrounded by men who dared not question his judgment, Stalin would persist until the very end in believing that the German threat was no more than a gigantic bluff. The key to a German victory over Russia would be speed above all else. Hitler insisted that Soviet forces in the West would have to be defeated within 10 weeks of the start of the invasion. A complete German victory would have to be won within 17 weeks. The reason was not just the notorious Russian winter, but also the inescapable fact that there would only be enough fuel, ammunition, and supplies for a quick and decisive campaign. Time was everything. From the start, German planners had to take account of a major natural obstacle which lay in the path of any direct thrust into the Soviet Union. The Pripyat Marshes was a vast area of swamps and forests, 150 miles long and 300 miles deep. It was expected that the Soviet defenders would be in two main concentrations, divided by the marshes, with a reserve around Moscow. The German offensive, codenamed Operation Otto, would be launched by three army groups, two of them to the north of the marshes and one to the south. Army Group Center would have the most important task, a drive straight towards Moscow, the hub of the Soviet system. Army Group North would push towards Leningrad, an important arms production center. Army Group South would attack towards Kiev, from southern Poland and from Romania. After all three army groups had pushed deep into the interior, the northern and southern groups would swing inwards to support Army Group Center for the final advance on the Soviet capital. The threat to Moscow would draw in the remnants of the Red Army and ensure their total destruction. Although the Army High Command had developed its plan over 4 painstaking months, testing and refining it with war games, Adolf Hitler was far from satisfied. Haunted by the fate of Napoleon, who had taken Moscow but failed to destroy the Russian army, he insisted that the Soviet capital was irrelevant. In early December, at a stroke, Hitler changed the entire emphasis of the campaign. His new plan was named Operation Barbarossa. Hitler insisted that the Red Army had to be destroyed west of a line linking the rivers Dnieper and Dwina. His plan was designed, above all else, to prevent the enemy from withdrawing into the interior. As before, Army Group North would strike towards Leningrad. Army Group Center would force a breakthrough towards Minsk and Smolensk. However, in the new plan, their main task would be to destroy the Red Army in the north. They would achieve this by 2 encirclement operations, one around Minsk and the second in the Baltic states. The Baltic offensive would culminate in the capture of Leningrad and give the Wehrmacht valuable ports to supply its offensive. Below the Pripyat Marshes, Army Group South would make a single thrust towards the Dnieper at Kiev and would drive southeast along the river to prevent a Russian withdrawal. The Soviets would be attacked from the rear and annihilated. Army Group South would then push east towards the industrial Donets Basin and the oil fields of the Caucasus. Only after their great flanking operations had destroyed the bulk of the Red Army would the invaders turn their attention to the capture of Moscow. After the destruction of the reserve Russian armies and the fall of the Soviet capital, the next stage would be the establishment of a German defensive line stretching from Archangel to the River Volga. The last remaining industrial areas east of the Volga and beyond the Ural Mountains would now be in easy reach of the German Air Force and would be bombed into the ground. Without an industrial base, the Russians would be unable to mount an effective resistance for the foreseeable future. Operation Barbarossa depended for its success on the performance of the armored formations which would spearhead every thrust. However, the men who led the panzer groups were already deeply unhappy with the plan. Heinz Guderian, the tactician who had done most to develop German armored warfare, pleaded for a bolder stroke. The panzers, stripped to their fighting core and supplied by parachute drop, should race deep into the Soviet Union, perhaps even to Moscow, completely paralyzing the Russian defense. Mopping up could be left to the infantry following on behind. Hitler and his senior commanders, nearly all infantry and artillerymen by training, would have none of Guderian's plan. The panzers were to fight classic battles of encirclement, no deeper than a few hundred miles into the Soviet Union. In the early stages, the armor would even be controlled by infantry generals. The panzer leaders, Germany's greatest assets in its campaigns so far, would begin the most ambitious offensive in the Reich's history with their hands firmly tied. Since the start of the war in Europe, the Soviet Union had been building vast stockpiles of food, strategic metals, and oil. At the same time, an increasing proportion of Soviet industry was being located far to the east, in relative safety beyond the Urals. However, Stalin resolutely ignored advice to move the strategic stockpiles east as well. The disagreement was part of a larger dispute between Stalin and his military planners. Where should the forces defending the Soviet Union be deployed? On the western borders or deeper inside the Russian heartland? During the 1930s, the backbone of the Russian defense was the Stalin Line, a series of fortified areas. The most formidable stretches were in the north, those between the Pripyat marshes and the upper Dniester, and those guarding the approaches to key cities and towns near the frontier zone: Leningrad, Pskov, Smolensk, Kiev, Korostan, and Odessa. The system was capable of causing immense problems for any invader, and it sheltered the main Red Army formations along with their supply depots and training areas. By 1941, Russian expansion in Poland, the Baltic, and Romania had left the defenses of the Stalin Line well to the east of the Soviet frontier. Stalin now insisted that the Red Army should move west, leaving its fortifications and supply dumps behind, and take up positions on the new borders. Stalin's insistence on a forward defense was strongly opposed by many Russian commanders. They feared that in the event of a German attack, they would be outflanked all too quickly. There was little time to build new defenses, and the Army's lines of communication to its base areas were now dangerously stretched. nor were there adequate mobile forces well behind the borders to counterattack a German breakthrough. Stalin, however, had his own agenda. He had hopes that he might yet mount another invasion of Finland or snatch more territory in the Balkans. Meanwhile, the Red Army was expected to mount a defense of the Soviet Union from little more than an incomplete system of trenches. Walter von Brauchitsch was appointed by Hitler Commander-in-Chief of the German Army in 1938. A competent, but by no means outstanding soldier, he was chosen more for his pliability than for his professional qualities. At the same time, the once powerful post of Commander-in-Chief was downgraded, becoming merely an instrument for carrying out Hitler's orders. Although Brauchitsch was in charge of operational matters during the Polish and Western campaigns, he had no real say in the way the war as a whole was fought. On one occasion, Brauchitsch did try to stand up to Hitler. During the preparation of the French campaign, he criticized the logistical side of the plan, and for his pains, he was severely reprimanded. To add to the indignity, Hitler refused to let him resign. When Operation Barbarossa was being drawn up, Brauchitsch voiced doubts that the Luftwaffe could fight both Britain and Russia at once. Hitler instantly browbeat him into submission, and when Brauchitsch supported a direct thrust at Moscow, he was told that only ossified brains could think of such an idea. Humiliated, it was the last attempt Brauchitsch made to challenge Hitler's plan or to defend the professional independence of the German army. Georgy Zhukov had joined the Russian army during the Great War and the Red Army in 1918, rising quickly through the ranks. A ruthless and hard-driving commander, utterly intolerant of weaknesses in his subordinates, Zhukov made his reputation during the Russian-Japanese War in Mongolia in 1939. There, he won his victories by insisting on rigid cooperation between artillery, tanks and infantry, and by a total disregard for casualties. In January 1941, Zhukov had taken part in elaborate war games, supervised by the Defense Commissar, Marshal Timoshenko. Zhukov had commanded the forces representing the Germans and had succeeded in wiping out the Russian defenders on the borders and penetrating deep into Soviet territory. Afterwards, Stalin fired the chief of the General Staff and Zhukov was given his job. Like virtually all Soviet commanders, Zhukov subscribed to the belief that the best form of defense was attack, and that to do this, room was needed for maneuver. He disagreed profoundly with Stalin's plan for a forward defense of the western frontiers, and wanted to hold back strong formations in the interior. Although Zhukov would go on to be one of the few Red Army commanders willing to argue openly with the dictator, this time he did not dare press his case too hard. Following his decision to invade Russia, Hitler had ordered a major expansion from 10 to 20. Typically, the order had been made without considering where the extra tanks were to come from. As a result, the number of machines in each division fell by more than a third, down to an average of 160 tanks. Nor were there enough of the newer, heavier models to compensate. More than half the machines available for Barbarossa would be Mark 1s and 2s and Czech 38s, light tanks never meant to be part of the Panzer divisions. There was also a shortage of supporting vehicles. Each armoured division needed almost 3,000 trucks to carry infantry, fuel and other supplies. Newly formed motorised infantry divisions also needed trucks, and Hitler had made no provision for increased production. Many units were instead equipped with captured vehicles, mostly French, much less robust than German types. There was also a 50% shortfall in stocks of tyres. In fact, so far was the German army from being a mechanised fighting force that the infantry divisions would haul their supplies into the Soviet Union using 625,000 horses. In Poland and the West, the Luftwaffe had played a key role in supporting ground operations. German aircraft had provided an umbrella for the infantry, had disrupted enemy communications, and had hammered troop concentrations and fortified positions. This time, it was by no means certain that the Air Force could perform anything like as well. In the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe had been dreadfully mauled, and it had no more aircraft for the Russian campaign than it had deployed against France in 1940. Meantime, one-third of its available machines were desperately in need of service or repair. The Mark III Panzer had been designed in 1937 as the mainstay of the German armoured divisions. In the Battle of France, the Mark III had encountered Allied tanks with very heavy armour, and its 37mm gun proved nowhere near powerful enough to cope. After the 1940 battles, Hitler ordered the Mark III fitted with a more powerful 50mm L-60 high-velocity gun. However, because of supply problems and the confusion which typically arose when attempts were made to keep up with the Führer's personal interventions, a different gun was actually fitted. The 50mm L-42 had a lower muzzle velocity than the L-60, and in the Soviet Union, it would prove ineffective against the thick, sloping armour of the latest Soviet tanks. For Operation Barbarossa, German fighter groups were equipped with the Messerschmitt 109, a superb aircraft, superior to any current Soviet fighter. The 109F, which reached the squadrons in the spring of 1941, was a substantial improvement on its predecessor. Its fuselage was aerodynamically cleaner, and its wingspan had been slightly increased, giving a better performance at all altitudes. The airframe was also strengthened to exploit the extra power offered by new versions of the DB601 engine. Fast, maneuverable, and a delight to fly, the 109F was armed with a single cannon firing through the spinner and two machine guns on the nose. Because pilots were unhappy with the 15mm cannon fitted to early Fs, later versions mounted a far more destructive 20mm weapon. The Pak-36 anti-tank gun had entered service with the German army in 1938. In the Battle of France, the 37mm weapon had been far from adequate against the heavy armor of many French and British tanks. Its shot could penetrate 50mm of plate at 500 meters, but only in ideal conditions, with the projectile hitting the armor at right angles. In 1940, a more powerful version of the gun was introduced. The 50mm Pak-38 could penetrate 80mm of armor at 500 meters, although again, only under perfect conditions. In Russia, of the 72 anti-tank guns in each infantry division, less than 1/10 would be Pak-38s. The rest would be the much less effective 37mm weapon. The stunning victories of the previous 2 years had left the German soldier utterly confident of the invincibility of the Wehrmacht. In training, tactics, and leadership in the field, the German army had been shown to be without equal. By 1941, it was even better than before. Training had been improved in the light of battlefield experience, and the relations between the men and their officers, always good, had been tempered in combat to a new level of confidence and trust. As for the officers themselves, although they were as tactically skilled and as disciplined as at any time in the history of the German army, many had little else in common with their forebears. Under Hitler, the influence of the traditional military class had declined, and rearmament had increased the size of the officer corps very quickly. A large number of newly commissioned men were committed Nazis, and even amongst the rest, there was a gradual acceptance of many Nazi beliefs. The conviction that Russians were an inferior race and a hatred for Jews was by now widespread amongst German officers. When Hitler demanded that in Russia ruthless measures must be taken against Bolshevists, partisans and Jews, there was little protest from German commanders at any level. In the Soviet Union, the German army would descend to levels of barbarism that the officer of only a generation before would have found unthinkable. Although the Red Army could field 4.5 million men and 23,000 tanks, more armor than the rest of the world put together, its equipment was mostly obsolete, its doctrines were confused, and its operational effectiveness was abysmally poor. Finland, and now the German victories in France, had shocked the army into frantic efforts to reform itself. But the task was a mammoth one. A top priority was rebuilding the large-scale mechanized corps which Stalin had disbanded in 1939. Their tanks had been scattered amongst the infantry divisions, and now they had to be equipped, manned, and trained from scratch. By the spring of 1941, the reorganization of the Soviet armed forces was still far from complete, only 30% of Russian tanks were fully serviceable. The new mechanized corps had only half the machines they had been promised, lacked motorized support vehicles, and had no tracked supply or infantry vehicles at all. Motor transport was short throughout the Red Army, as were spare parts. Ammunition supplies were a problem for the artillery, for the newer tanks, and for the anti-tank guns. There was also a desperate lack of ancillary equipment, particularly radios. And in nearly all Russian armoured formations, only the tank of the unit commander would be equipped with wireless. Like the rest of the Red Army, the Air Force was burdened with huge numbers of obsolete machines, and it too suffered from poor maintenance and equipment shortages. The Air Force's problems would be compounded by the fact that of 1,000 airfields in the West, only 200 were operationally serviceable. The BT series of fast tanks was based on a revolutionary suspension system developed in America and licensed to the Russians in the early 1930s. The machines had a superb cross-country performance and were capable of almost 50 miles per hour. Although it was armed with a 45mm gun, almost as good as the best of its German counterparts, the BT-7 was lightly armoured and could easily be destroyed by any German tank or anti-tank gun. BT-7s made up the bulk of Red Army medium tank forces on the eve of the German invasion. The T-34 was the best all-round tank design of the Second World War and entered service with the Red Army in the summer of 1940. Its excellent suspension had been developed from the BT-7, and with its wide tracks and powerful diesel engine, it was capable of traversing ground that would be impossible to any other tank of its weight. The T-34's armour was thick and well sloped to deflect anti-tank rounds. The tank was armed with a high-velocity 75mm gun, better than any other tank gun in the world. With such a powerful weapon, the T-34 could engage and destroy an enemy at long range with little risk to itself. In the 12 months up to the German invasion, the Soviet Union produced almost 1,200 T-34s, and in spite of initial teething troubles, they would have an effect on the course of the battle, out of all proportion to their numbers. The Petlyakov PE-2 entered frontline service with the Soviet Air Force in late 1940. Although designed as a high-altitude fighter, it was as a light bomber that the aircraft became one of the most useful weapons in the Russian armory. A popular aircraft with the men who flew it, the PE-2 was easy to handle, stable in a dive, and capable of very accurate bombing. It was also faster than the German 109E fighter, although when it encountered the later 109F, it had to depend for survival on its high-altitude capability, and bombing accuracy suffered as a result. The PE-2 would prove one of the most successful aircraft of its type in any Allied Air Force, and it would be updated throughout the war. Although only 458 were in service at the start of Operation Barbarossa, before the battle was over, the aircraft would take a very heavy toll of German armour and supply columns. Before Stalin's purge, the Red Army had been an innovative and highly professional force. The loss of a whole generation of highly trained men had left it desperately lacking skilled commanders of all ranks. There was a wave of early promotions, and thousands of officers suddenly held commands well beyond their abilities. Of those leading regiments, barely more than 10% had been trained above the level of junior lieutenant. A massive training program was mounted, particularly aimed at infantry officers, but there was little time. The situation was so serious that 4,000 ex-commanders were released from labor camps or brought back from disgrace. The rapid expansion of the Russian Air Force posed even greater training problems than those faced by the army. Pilots took a great deal of time to produce, and the flying schools were overburdened and ill-equipped. There was also a shortage of combat-experienced instructors. Many Russian pilots would fight the veterans of the Luftwaffe with only 15 hours flying time behind them, and even amongst the better trained, tactical skills were extremely poor. In Directive 21, Hitler's order for the attack on Russia, he had given a date of May the 15th, by which time all preparations must be complete. By the beginning of the month, nearly 80 German divisions were already in place, their movements covered by an elaborate campaign of deception and disinformation. Dozens of forward airfields had been built in secret, and vast quantities of fuel, stores and ammunition stockpiled close to the jumping-off areas. However, there were already signs that Hitler's timetable was falling to pieces. The winter of 1940 had been exceptionally long and harsh, and the eastern frontier regions were still a quagmire. Neither had the army yet received anything like the number of trucks it needed. With a postponement looking ever more likely, events in the south soon made it inescapable. In October 1940, Greece had been invaded by the Italians, but the Greeks had succeeded in driving them back to Albania. The British sent an expeditionary force to help Greece, suddenly posing a grave threat to Germany's Romanian oil supplies. Adolf Hitler was furious at the British intervention and ordered the invasion and occupation of Greece. The Greek campaign was intended to be a simple operation, and Hitler thought he could count on the support of Yugoslavia. However, on March the 27th, an anti-German faction, encouraged by British agents, mounted a coup and deposed the Yugoslav government. Hitler was forced to improvise. On April the 6th, German troops, led by powerful panzer formations, swept into both Yugoslavia and Greece. Until the armored units could be retrieved from the Balkans, the invasion of the Soviet Union would have to wait. The new date for Operation Barbarossa was June the 22nd.